In every city, there are stories that never made the papers. Not because they weren't important, but because they were inconvenient. They live in forgotten files, in half-finished investigations, in questions no one wanted answered. This isn't where justice always wins. This is where the echoes remain. This is Reverberating Noir. Some silences are heavier than others, the kind that settle into a room like smoke, the kind that tell you before you've seen a thing that something has gone permanently, irreversibly wrong. Welcome to Reverberating Noir.
July 1879, Atlanta. And a young man named Martin Walker is standing in a doorway, holding his breath, trying to understand why his grandparents' house is this quiet.
He would understand soon enough, and once he did, he could never unknow it.
What followed was 2 trials, 2 wrongful convictions, and a killer who was never found. 147 years later, the case is still open, still breathing.
This is the DeFoor murders, and this is Reverberating Noir. Let's place ourselves west of Atlanta, near what would eventually become Bolton. The summer of 1879 is the kind of summer that presses down on you, humid, relentless, the air thick with cicadas and red clay dust. Martin and Susan DeFoor had lived in that landscape for decades. They were pioneers in the truest sense of the word. Martin was 73, Susan 82. He'd helped establish DeFoors Ferry across the Chattahoochee River, a working crossing, a lifeline for the whole region. These were not invisible people. They were woven into the fabric of that community.
And that matters. Because when something happens to people, like that visible people, rooted people, the community feels it as a kind of rupture. The assumption of safety collapses. And when that happens, the pressure to find someone, anyone, becomes enormous.
Enormous. And dangerous. But we'll get there.
Walker arrived at the homestead in the early morning of July the 26th. He'd felt something wrong before he even opened the door. His grandparents kept a strict rhythm up before 4 a.m, chores already underway by the time most people were dreaming. That morning, nothing. No light, no sound, no movement.
He pushed the door open, and the silence hit him like something physical.
The inquest later placed the time of death between midnight and 1 a.m. Susan DeFoor's injuries were catastrophic, her head nearly severed. Martin's wounds were so severe, investigators believed he never regained consciousness. The weapon was an axe. Walker's own axe, taken from the woodpile outside. It was found afterward in the fireplace ashes. Discarded, like it meant nothing.
Boots were missing. A wallet was gone. But $18 in silver sitting right there on the bureau untouched, left behind like an afterthought. Or a message.
And that detail is one of the first things that tells you this wasn't a straightforward robbery. Whoever did this took promissory notes paper that would have been nearly impossible to redeem without identification and left hard currency. Either they didn't understand what they were taking, or they didn't care about the money at all.
Or they wanted something else entirely. Here is where the story changes shape, where it stops being a murder and becomes something more unsettling. Because when investigators moved through that house, really moved through it, they found something upstairs, in the attic.
Someone had been living there.
Not passing through. Living.
A slept-in bed. Muddy footprints pressed into the windowsill. Human waste accumulated in a lumber room nearby. This person had been in that attic for days, possibly longer, watching the household below them, learning the rhythms, the 4 a.m. risings, the placement of the axe, the layout of the rooms.
And Martin and Susan DeFoor had no idea. They went to sleep every night in their own home, and somewhere above their heads someone was waiting.
The barefoot prints led from the attic, down to the kitchen where food and milk had been taken, and then to the woodpile. One set of prints. One person.
One person who had planned this, or at minimum had been present long enough for planning to become possible. That's not impulsive violence, that's something colder.
And that coldness makes the $18 even stranger. If you've invested days into this, if you've been patient enough to wait, why leave the cash?
Because the cash wasn't the point.
The investigation that followed was to put it plainly, a product of its time and place. Post-Civil War Georgia, Reconstruction crumbling, racial terror operating as a social mechanism. And into that environment, suspicion fell immediately on a local black man named Asa Gunn.
No evidence connected him to the crime. None.
Investigators used bloodhounds not to track a scent from the scene, but effectively to coerce a confession through physical violence. Gunn was mauled. He confessed. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang. Then he recanted. He stated clearly that he had been held down and attacked until he said what they wanted him to say.
His conviction was overturned. No evidence. Just terror dressed up as justice.
And the real question, the one that should have been driving the investigation from the beginning, went unanswered. Who had actually been in that attic?
4 years passed, and then something shifted.
A man named Joe Johnson came forward with a confession. He named 2 accomplices, John Brown and Tom Savinger. And here is where it gets complicated, because Johnson's account contained details that seemed to indicate genuine knowledge of the crime scene. He described the interior of the DeFoor house accurately. He placed the silver on the bureau. He knew things.
Convictions followed, death sentences handed down, and then the whole structure collapsed.
No physical evidence, no corroborating witnesses. Johnson's story, under scrutiny, was a fabrication. The prosecution's response, and this is documented, was essentially that a retrial would be too expensive. 3 men walked free. The case was quietly set aside.
2 trials, 2 sets of wrongful convictions, 0 accountability. And somewhere out there, the person who had spent days in that attic, who had raised that axe in the dark, was simply gone.
And that's the pattern I want to sit with for a moment, because it's not unique to 1879. It's not unique to Georgia. The pressure to close a case to give a community its resolution can be so intense that the actual truth becomes secondary. You find a name. You build a story around the name. And the real questions get buried under the paperwork.
The system didn't fail in spite of itself. It failed according to its own logic. That's the part that doesn't go away.
Asa Gunn. We don't know what happened to him after his conviction was overturned. His name appears in records and then simply stops. Whether he survived the physical violence of the investigation, whether he rebuilt any kind of life, we don't know. History swallowed him.
While the real killer got to keep theirs. I want to return to that attic for a moment, because I think it's the image that stays with you. Not the violence as terrible as it was, but the days before, the patience. Someone moving through that house in the dark, learning it, eating their food, sleeping in their bed. And below, 2 elderly people living out their ordinary days completely unaware.
That's the psychological dimension that makes this case so difficult to categorize. The premeditation, if that's what it was, doesn't align with the outcome. The silver left behind. The promissory notes taken. The boots. It reads like someone who was planning something, but the plan itself doesn't cohere. Which raises the possibility that the days in the attic weren't strategic preparation. They were something else.
Compulsion. Fixation. Something that doesn't have a clean name.
And if that's true, if this was driven by something internal rather than external, then the question of motive becomes almost unanswerable. Because you can't follow the money when the money was left on the bureau. You can't follow the logic when the logic was never the point.
The Atlanta Constitution called it Georgia's most mysterious tragedy. And they weren't wrong. But I think the mystery runs deeper than the identity of the killer. The mystery is what this case reveals about how we respond when violence doesn't make sense, when there's no clean narrative to hand the community.
We manufacture one. We find the most available suspect. We apply pressure until a confession appears. And then we call it resolved, even when nothing has actually been resolved.
And the real story, the attic, the days of waiting, the $18 left gleaming on the bureau gets buried under the story we needed to be true.
147 years later, DeFoors Ferry Road still carries that name. Martin's Ferry is gone, replaced by asphalt and traffic signals. The DeFoor house was torn down within weeks of the murders by a grieving son-in-law. The lumber was used to build a barn across the road, as if dismantling the structure could dismantle the memory.
It couldn't. It never can.
The DeFoor Centre, an event space near Midtown, carries the name forward in a different way. There are stories of a presence there, a woman in 19th century dress seen near the windows. Whether you believe in that kind of thing or not, there's something worth noting. We need her to be there. The persistence of that story tells you something about how unfinished this feels.
Susan DeFoor was 82 years old. She had survived the Civil War. She had watched Georgia rebuild itself from the wreckage of a conflict that tore the country apart. She had lived long enough to see the world change in ways she probably couldn't have imagined when she was young, and she was killed in her sleep by someone who had been living above her head for days.
And no one was ever held accountable. Not really.
That's the weight of it. Not just the violence, but the silence that followed. The way the case was handled, mishandled, and ultimately abandoned. The way two innocent men were convicted and the real perpetrator was never seriously pursued. The way Asa Gunn's name disappeared from the record while the case lingered on in newspaper archives and local legend.
The lesson that wasn't learned. That's what makes this more than a historical curiosity. Every time we've rushed to judgment in a high-pressure case, every time a confession has been extracted through coercion, every time a prosecution has been abandoned because retrial was deemed too expensive, there's an echo of 1879 in that.
The DeFoor murders weren't just unsolved, they were unlearned. If you've been with us tonight, if this case has settled into you the way it settled into me, then you already know what Reverberating Noir is trying to do. We're not here to shock you. We're here to make you sit with the cases that don't resolve cleanly. The ones that ask uncomfortable questions about systems, about judgment, about the stories we tell ourselves to feel safe. If that's the kind of storytelling you want more of, subscribe to Reverberating Noir. Leave us a comment. Tell us which part of this stayed with you. Because these cases deserve to be heard, and they deserve to be heard carefully.
The person who spent those days in the DeFoor attic was never identified. The motive was never established. The $18 is still sitting on that bureau, in a sense, unexplained, untouched, waiting. We closed the case twice without ever actually solving it. And I think that's worth remembering the next time we're told that justice has been done.
Drive down DeFoors Ferry Road sometime. Slow down. Look at the oaks. Listen to the river. Some silences are heavier than others, and some of them are still waiting to be broken. The recording ends here, but the case doesn't. Somewhere, the evidence still exists. The questions still wait. If this story stayed with you, if it followed you into the silence, subscribe to Reverberating Noir. Not for us, for the stories that refuse to disappear.
Because as long as something doesn't make sense, the truth is still out there. And someone will find it.
Until next time, keep listening to the dark.